The sliding doors of Denver International Airport burst open with a hiss sharp enough to turn heads. Two young men stepped inside, and within minutes, someone was going to decide they didn't belong there. The cold wind chased them through the doorway before dying against the polished floors of the terminal. Outside, the late November sky hung low and grey over the Rockies. Inside, the airport glowed with fluorescent light and restless movement. Rolling suitcases rattled across tile. Coffee machines hissed. Flight announcements echoed overhead like distant thunder. The holiday travel rush had already begun. But the two men walking through the entrance didn't look like the kind of passengers who drew attention. They looked like background noise. The older one, Ethan Carter, moved first. 28 years old, tall, lean. A worn grey hoodie hung loose over his shoulders, the fabric faded from years of washing. His cargo pants sagged slightly at the pockets. On his feet were scuffed white sneakers that had clearly seen better days. His younger brother Ryan followed beside him. 24, a little shorter, a little sharper in the eyes. He wore a black tracksuit zipped halfway up and a pair of dark sunglasses, even though they were indoors. Neither man carried a suitcase, just one battered leather duffel bag slung over Ethan's shoulder. People noticed that. They always did. A woman walking past slowed slightly, her eyes flicking from Ethan's hoodie to the bag. A middle-aged man in a wool coat paused beside the Starbucks line and watched them for half a second too long. The judgment was quiet. But it was there. Ryan checked his phone. "Our flight boards in 40 minutes, he said. His voice was calm, low, the kind of voice that didn't rush. Ethan nodded without looking at him. Good. Ryan glanced around the terminal. The crowds, the endless lines, families wrestling with luggage, business travelers glued to laptops. Food first, Ryan asked, or we go straight to the lounge? Ethan exhaled slowly. I want that sparkling water they keep in the Diamond Lounge, he said. The one they pretend is rare. Ryan smirked. You mean the one that costs them $2 a bottle? Ethan finally looked over at him. Exactly. They kept walking, through the chaos, past the crowded economy check-in counters where passengers snaked through retractable belts like cattle in a maze, past the anxious travelers arguing with airline agents, past the smell of burnt coffee and airport sanitizer. And then they turned toward a different part of the terminal, a quieter one. The carpet changed first, soft, thick, deep red. The noise dropped like someone had turned down a volume knob. At the end of the hallway stood a brushed steel sign. Skybridge Airlines, First Class and Diamond Elite Check-In. Behind the counter, 3 airline agents stood in crisp navy uniforms with gold trim. They were the gatekeepers. They knew exactly who belonged here, and who didn't. The moment Ethan and Ryan stepped onto the red carpet, something shifted in the room. It was subtle, but it was immediate. The woman standing at the center counter looked up from her computer. Linda Parker, 46 years old. Her blonde hair was sprayed into a shape that hadn't moved in years. Her posture was rigid, professional. But the moment she saw the 2 men walking toward her, her smile froze halfway onto her face, then disappeared completely. Her eyes moved quickly. Hoodie, tracksuit, 1 bag, no luggage, no suit jackets, no watches, no visible status. Her fingers stopped typing. To the right of the counter, a security guard leaned against a luggage cart. His name tag read Mike Donnelly, late 30s, thick neck, buzz cut. The kind of man who had spent years waiting for someone to give him a reason to step in. Linda's gaze flicked toward him, just for a second, then back to the brothers. They stopped in front of the counter. Ethan rested his forearms lightly against the marble surface. The stone was cool beneath his skin. He smiled. It was a polite smile, the kind that expected normal human interaction. "We're checking in for flight SB402 to London," he said. "Running a little close, but we're carry-on only." Linda didn't smile back. She leaned back slightly in her chair, folding her arms. Her eyes moved slowly from Ethan's hoodie to Ryan's sunglasses, then to the duffel bag, then back to Ethan's face. "This line," she said carefully, "is for first-class passengers." The way she said it made the sentence heavier than it needed to be. Ryan pushed his sunglasses slightly down his nose and looked at her directly. "We know." Linda blinked once. The faintest hint of irritation crossed her face. Behind the brothers, a man in a tailored charcoal suit approached the counter. He stopped when he realized something was happening. He checked his watch. He waited. Linda pointed vaguely towards the far end of the terminal. "Economy check-in is back that way," she said. "Past the Starbucks." Ryan let out a slow breath through his nose. Ethan remained calm. "We're in the right line," Ethan said gently. Linda's smile returned, but it wasn't warm. It was thin, tight. "I seriously doubt that," she said. Ryan leaned slightly closer to the counter. "Just scan the ticket," he said. Ethan pulled out his phone. The screen lit up. A digital boarding pass filled the display. Black interface, minimal design, a QR code glowing in the center. Linda didn't look at it, not even for a second. Instead, she kept staring at Ethan. "Sir," she said, "I'm going to need to see ID, and I'll also need to inspect that bag." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Since when?" Linda shrugged casually. "New policy." Ryan tilted his head slightly. "Funny," he said quietly. "We flew through here last week." Linda's expression hardened. Behind them, the businessman in the suit cleared his throat impatiently. "Is there a problem?" he asked. But he wasn't asking Ethan. He was asking Linda. Linda's entire posture changed instantly. "Oh no, Mr. Coleman," she said brightly, "just clearing up some confusion." Then she turned back to the brothers, and the warmth vanished again. "Look," she said flatly, "I'm going to save us all some time." Her eyes narrowed. "You two are clearly in the wrong place." Ryan slid his sunglasses back up over his eyes. "Scan the code," he repeated. Linda's jaw tightened. "No," she said. Silence fell over the counter. Not loud silence, but the kind that spreads. Passengers nearby slowed down. A woman walking past pretended to check her phone while watching the interaction. Linda leaned forward. "I'm not letting you hold up my line while you try to scam your way into first class," she said. The word scam hung in the air. Heavy. Ugly. Ethan didn't move. Ryan didn't move. Behind the counter, Linda reached for the phone beside her keyboard, and without breaking eye contact, she pressed the button. "Security," she said calmly. "I need assistance at the first-class desk." Near the luggage cart, Mike Donnelly straightened up. For the first time that afternoon, the boredom left his face. Something was finally happening. Mike Donnelly pushed himself off the luggage cart, like a man finally invited into a fight. His boots thudded softly against the carpet as he walked toward the counter. The gold badge clipped to his belt caught the overhead lights for a moment, before disappearing under the shadow of his broad frame. He moved slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of his presence arrive before his words did. Passengers nearby turned their heads. People always did when security walked in. Linda Parker didn't look away from Ethan Carter. Her chin lifted slightly, the way people do when they believe authority has just entered the room on their behalf. "Problem here?" Mike asked. His voice was low, gravelly, the kind of voice meant to make people step back. Linda answered before either brother could speak. "These two are refusing to leave the first-class area," she said. "They don't have valid credentials, and they're becoming disruptive." Ryan let out a quiet laugh. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Disruptive. He rubbed his jaw slowly as if tasting the word. "Disruptive," he repeated. Ethan didn't move. His arms were still resting on the marble counter, fingers loosely folded together. Calm, controlled, watching everything. Mike stepped closer, close enough now that Ryan could smell the faint scent of coffee and cheap aftershave. "Sir," Mike said, looking directly at Ryan, "I'm going to need you to step back from the counter." Ryan looked down briefly at the man's hand, hovering near his belt, then back at his face. "We're checking in for a flight," Ryan said evenly. Mike's eyes narrowed. Linda leaned forward in her chair. "They've already been told they're in the wrong line," she said sharply. "They refuse to leave." Behind the brothers, Richard Coleman checked his watch again. The businessman's irritation had begun to boil into something more vocal. "I've been waiting 5 minutes," he muttered. "What exactly is going on here?" Linda's voice softened instantly when she turned toward him. "So sorry for the delay, Mr. Coleman," she said. "We're just handling a small security issue." Security issue. The phrase rolled through the air like a stone dropped in water. People nearby began to slow down. Phones appeared in hands. Ryan noticed. So did Ethan. Mike shifted his weight and stepped directly between the brothers and the counter. His body blocked their view of Linda now. "I'm going to ask one more time," Mike said. "Step away from the desk." Ryan didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. "You going to scan the ticket or not?" he asked calmly, looking past Mike toward Linda. That did it. Mike reached forward and placed a firm hand against Ryan's chest. Not violent, but unmistakably forceful. "Step back." Ryan's eyes dropped to the hand pressing against his tracksuit. For a moment, the entire terminal seemed to slow. The security cameras mounted in the ceiling hummed quietly. The distant voice of an airline announcement echoed through the concourse. Ryan slowly looked up. "Don't touch me," he said. Mike pushed harder. Ryan stumbled half a step backward. The duffel bag slid from Ethan's shoulder and hit the carpet with a dull thud. That sound echoed louder than it should have. Ethan's hands came up instantly, palms open. "Hey," he said calmly. "Relax." Ryan steadied himself, brushing his chest where Mike's hand had been. A few passengers gasped quietly, Someone whispered. Mike squared his shoulders, ready for escalation. But it never came. Instead, Ethan reached down, picked up the duffel bag, and slung it back over his shoulder. "We're leaving the counter," he said. He looked at Linda. "You won't scan the ticket." "Fine." Ryan turned slightly toward him. "You serious?" he murmured. Ethan nodded once. "We'll go straight to the gate." Linda leaned forward again, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Oh no, you won't," she said. Ethan paused. "What did you just do?" Ryan asked. Linda's lips curled into something that almost resembled satisfaction. "I flagged your reservation," she said. "You won't get through security now." Ryan blinked once, then slowly turned back toward the counter. "You did what?" Linda tapped one last key and leaned back in her chair. "Disruptive passengers," she said loudly. "Security risk." Her voice carried just enough to reach the nearby travelers. People were definitely filming now. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Not angry, not loud, just studying her face, memorizing it. "You really want to do that?" he said quietly. Linda shrugged. "Watch me." Ryan exhaled sharply. "We should call Dad," he muttered under his breath. Ethan shook his head slightly. "Not yet." Ryan stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "She just blacklisted our tickets." "She thinks she did," Ethan corrected softly. Mike folded his arms, watching the brothers carefully. From his perspective, the situation was over. The threat had been removed. Two men who clearly didn't belong had been pushed away from a restricted area. He felt the familiar satisfaction of control returning. "Time to move along," he said. Ethan nodded once. "Already on our way." The brothers turned. They walked away from the counter slowly, the eyes of half the terminal following them. Behind them, Linda Parker was still smiling. Richard Coleman stepped forward immediately. "Finally," he said. "Some order around here." Linda turned back to her keyboard, posture straight, professional again. "Sorry about the interruption, Mr. Coleman. Let's get you checked in." But 20 yards away, Ethan and Ryan had already reached the escalator leading toward the security checkpoint. Ryan leaned closer. "You're way too calm right now," he said quietly. Ethan stepped onto the moving stairs. "They didn't cancel the ticket," he replied. Ryan frowned. "What?" "They can't." Ryan crossed his arms. "Then what did she flag?" "A note," Ethan said. "Just a note in the reservation." Ryan thought about that. The escalator hummed beneath their feet as they descended toward the TSA area. "And security's going to see it," Ryan said. "Yep." "And then what?" Ethan's eyes remained forward. "Then we find out how broken the rest of the system is." Ryan let out a slow whistle. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Ethan didn't answer. At the bottom of the escalator, the TSA pre-check line stretched ahead of them. Travelers shuffled forward slowly beneath bright overhead lights and blue-uniformed officers. Ryan held up his phone. "You think she actually blocked us?" Ethan gave a small smile. "She thinks she did." They reached the automated scanner. Ryan stepped forward first. He held his phone beneath the glowing red laser. The machine beeped. Then the screen flashed red. The TSA officer nearby frowned. "Sir," he said, motioning Ryan aside. "Step over here for a second." Ryan looked back at Ethan. "Well," he said, "here we go." The red light stayed on, not blinking, not flickering, just glowing steadily on the scanner like a warning. The TSA officer leaned closer to the screen, squinting slightly. His name badge read, Daniel Brooks, late 20s, clean haircut. The look of a man halfway through a long shift he hadn't expected to become interesting. "Step over here for me, sir," he said. Ryan stepped aside without argument. Behind him, Ethan placed his phone under the scanner. Another beep. Another red light. Daniel's eyebrows lifted. "Both of you," he said, gesturing toward a small inspection desk beside the line. Passengers behind them shifted impatiently. Suitcases rolled forward. A mother with 2 children tried to peek around Ryan's shoulder to see what was happening. Ryan slipped his sunglasses off and tucked them into the collar of his jacket. "Let me guess," he said. "Disruptive passengers." Daniel didn't respond immediately. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard on the small terminal. The screen reflected in his eyes as he read through the system notes. "Agent denied boarding. Security concern. Behavioral flag." He sighed quietly. "What happened at the check-in counter?" he asked without looking up. Ryan leaned against the desk. "We stood in line," he said. Daniel finally looked up. "That's it?" "That's it." Ethan stepped forward calmly beside him. "You might want to look at the reservation details," Ethan said. Daniel glanced back down at the screen. "I am." Ryan crossed his arms. "You're looking at the comments," he said. "Not the actual ticket." Daniel didn't answer. He continued scrolling through the system. Then he froze. The cursor stopped moving. For a moment, his expression didn't change. Then slowly his eyes widened. He leaned closer to the screen, as if the words might rearrange themselves. Passenger name, Ethan Carter. Passenger name, Ryan Carter. Ticket class, Chairman Priority. Reservation code, VIP 00001. Daniel blinked. Once. Then again. He leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at Ethan. Then at Ryan. Then back at the screen. "Carter," he said quietly. Ryan said nothing. Ethan remained perfectly still. Daniel lowered his voice. "As in, Jonathan Carter?" Ethan gave a small nod. "The same." The sound of rolling luggage continued behind them. A woman laughed somewhere down the hall. The airport's overhead announcement system chimed softly before another flight update echoed through the terminal. But around the inspection desk, the air shifted. Daniel swallowed. The name Jonathan Carter didn't just belong to a wealthy businessman. It belonged to the man whose company had financed half the new airport security infrastructure across the country. The body scanners, the updated baggage screening systems, even the training program Daniel himself had completed the year before, all funded by Carter Global Holdings. Daniel glanced back at the screen. Chairman Priority. He rubbed the back of his neck. "So, the gate agent flagged you as a security risk," he said carefully. Ryan nodded once. "She didn't like our hoodies." Daniel looked at Ethan. "That accurate?" Ethan shrugged slightly. "She refused to scan the boarding pass." Daniel let out a quiet breath. His fingers moved across the keyboard again, this time with a different rhythm. Manual override code. Access authorization. The system hesitated for half a second. Then the red warning box disappeared. The screen turned green. Daniel leaned back. "Well," he said quietly, "I didn't see any aggression." Ryan smiled faintly. "Funny how that works." Daniel handed Ryan's phone back to him. "You're cleared." Passengers behind them began moving again, relieved that the hold-up was ending. Ryan tucked the phone into his pocket. Ethan didn't move yet. "Leave the note," he said. Daniel looked up. "Excuse me." "The disruptive passenger note," Ethan repeated calmly. "Leave it." Daniel frowned. "You want it to stay?" "Yes." Ryan looked sideways at his brother. "You're serious?" Ethan nodded slightly. Daniel hesitated. Then he leaned forward again and typed one final command. The note remained. He looked back up at Ethan. "Your gate is B14, he said quietly. "Boarding should start soon." Ryan lifted his duffel bag from Ethan's shoulder and tossed it lightly back to him. "Appreciate it," he said. Daniel nodded. But as the brothers turned toward the security scanners, he added one more thing. "You might want to be ready when you get there." Ryan stopped. "Why?" Daniel gave a small, uneasy smile. "If the same agent flagged you in the system, she's probably already called the gate." Ryan looked at Ethan. Ethan didn't look surprised. "Let's find out," he said. They stepped through the body scanner one at a time. The machine hummed softly, its circular frame glowing faintly blue. TSA agents waved them forward without another word. Belts back on, phones back in pockets, duffel bag over Ethan's shoulder again. Normal travelers once more. Except the tension was building now. You could feel it. They walked through the main terminal toward the B concourse. The crowds thickened again. Holiday travelers rushed past, dragging suitcases, chasing boarding times, arguing quietly into phones. Ryan checked the overhead monitors. "Gate B14, he said. "Still boarding in 20 minutes. They turned the corner into the gate area and stopped. Standing at the podium near the jet bridge door was Linda Parker. She wasn't behind the check-in counter anymore. She had moved, just for them. Her navy uniform looked perfectly pressed under the fluorescent lights. Her hands rested on the gate desk microphone, as if she had been waiting there for some time. When she saw the brothers approaching, something dark flickered across her face. Triumph. Behind her, 2 gate agents were quietly tagging luggage for other passengers. But Linda wasn't working. She was watching. Passengers filled the rows of seats around the gate. Some scrolled through their phones. Others talked quietly among themselves. A few had already noticed the tension in the air. Ryan leaned slightly toward Ethan. "She followed us." Ethan nodded once. "Looks like it." They walked forward, step by step, closer to the podium. Linda straightened. Then she picked up the microphone. The small speaker crackled softly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice sharp enough to cut through the room, "we are currently dealing with a security situation at Gate B14. Heads turned immediately, phones lifted, eyes locked onto the 2 men walking toward the desk. Linda pointed directly at them. "These 2 individuals," she said loudly, "have breached airport security and will not be boarding this flight today." A murmur rolled through the waiting passengers. Ryan stopped walking. He stared at her. "You've got to be kidding me," he said quietly. Ethan kept moving. One step, then another. Linda's voice rose. "Security and airport police are already on their way." And somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the terminal. The room went quiet the way crowded places sometimes do when something ugly is about to happen. Not silent, just tight. Like the air had been pulled thinner. Linda Parker kept the microphone raised in her hand, her arm rigid, eyes locked on the two men approaching the podium. The overhead lights cast a pale shine across her carefully sprayed hair. Her mouth was set in a thin line that looked less like professionalism and more like victory. "These two individuals," she repeated into the microphone, "have caused multiple disturbances inside the terminal and attempted to bypass security procedures." A murmur spread through the waiting passengers. Someone whispered, "What did they do?" Another voice answered, "No idea." Phones came up. People always filmed when authority confronted someone. Ryan Carter stopped walking. Ethan Carter did not. He continued forward, steady, the leather duffel bag resting against his back. His sneakers moved softly across the carpet as if none of this concerned him. Ryan watched him for half a second, then followed. Linda lowered the microphone and stepped away from the podium. "Stop right there," she said sharply. Ethan stopped. Ryan stood beside him. Passengers leaned forward in their seats. A teenager near the charging station had already started live streaming the scene to his followers. A couple near the window exchanged uneasy glances. Behind the podium, the other gate agents had stopped working entirely. They were watching Linda, watching the brothers, watching the situation spiral into something much larger than a normal boarding delay. Ryan spoke first. "We didn't breach anything," he said calmly. "TSA cleared us." Linda scoffed. "Oh, really?" She tapped the computer screen behind the podium. "Because according to the system, you were flagged for aggressive behavior and security concerns." Ryan laughed quietly. "Aggressive?" The word again. "You mean standing in line?" he said. Linda stepped closer. "No," she said. "I mean refusing instructions from airline staff and attempting to force your way through restricted areas." Ethan's eyes drifted slowly across the gate area. He noticed everything. The way passengers leaned closer. The quiet clicking sound of camera lenses focusing. The tension tightening across Linda's shoulders. And the two uniformed airport police officers now approaching through the terminal corridor. Ryan noticed them too. "Here we go," he muttered. The officers stopped a few feet away. One of them stepped forward. Officer Grant Miller, 41 years old, broad shoulders, tired eyes that had spent years dealing with drunk passengers and missed connections. He looked at Linda first. "Are these the individuals?" he asked. Linda nodded instantly. "Yes." Her voice was loud again now, the performance returning. "They threatened me at the check-in desk, forced their way past security, and are now refusing to leave the gate area." Several passengers gasped softly. Ryan looked around at the crowd. "Is anyone actually hearing this?" he asked. Officer Miller turned to Ethan. "Sir," he said evenly, "I'm going to need you to come with us." Ethan didn't move. "We have valid tickets," he said calmly. "The airline has the right to refuse service," Miller replied automatically. "If they ask you to leave, you leave." Ryan rubbed his forehead slowly. "This is unbelievable," Behind them, a middle-aged woman whispered to her husband. "They should just go." Another passenger muttered, "Why make a scene?" Ethan heard them. He heard everything. The quiet judgments, the assumptions, the way the room had already decided what kind of men they must be. Officer Miller shifted his stance slightly. "Sir," he repeated, "let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Ethan finally moved, slowly. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie. The reaction was instant. "Hands!" one of the officers snapped. Behind the podium, Mike Donnelly had reappeared and reached for the taser clipped to his belt. Ryan raised both hands halfway. "Relax," he said. "He's grabbing his phone." Ethan pulled the phone out slowly and held it up where everyone could see. "Just making a call," he said. Linda laughed. It was a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Who exactly are you going to call?" she asked. "Your lawyer?" Ethan looked directly at her. "No." He unlocked the phone. Ryan leaned closer. "You're really doing this now?" Ethan nodded slightly. "If we leave," he said quietly, "this plane doesn't take off." Linda rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please." Officer Miller crossed his arms. "You have 30 seconds, he said. Ethan pressed a contact on the screen. The phone began to ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Passengers leaned forward in their seats. Even the gate agents behind the counter were watching now. Then the call connected. A deep voice filled the speaker. "Ethan." The voice carried weight. Age. Authority. "Did you boys land in London already?" Ryan glanced around the room. The entire gate area had gone still. Ethan spoke calmly. "No, Dad." A pause on the line. "Why not?" Ethan looked straight at Linda Parker. "We're still in Denver," he said. "At gate B14. Another pause. This one longer. "What's the problem?" Ethan's voice stayed level. "The gate lead says we don't belong in first class." Ryan folded his arms and leaned slightly against the podium. "She also called us thugs," he added. Across the room, someone whispered, "Did he just say Dad?" Linda's confidence flickered for the first time. The voice on the phone changed, not louder, but colder. "Is the phone on speaker?" the man asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "Good." The voice sharpened. "Put the gate lead on." Linda stared at the phone. Her confidence returned quickly. She leaned forward and spoke into it. "Listen, whoever this is." The voice cut her off. "I am Jonathan Carter." The words dropped into the room like a hammer. "CEO of Carter Global Holdings, owner of Skybridge Airlines." And suddenly, every single person standing at gate B14 realized something had gone very, very wrong. For a moment, no one breathed. The name Jonathan Carter didn't just hang in the air. It crashed into the room like a steel door slamming shut. Phones kept recording, but the whispers stopped. Even the distant airport noise seemed to fade, as if the terminal itself had leaned closer to listen. Linda Parker blinked. Once. Then again. Her hand, still gripping the edge of the podium, tightened slowly. "Excuse me?" she said. The voice on the phone didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I said," the man repeated, calm and unmistakably controlled. My name is Jonathan Carter. Across the gate area, a businessman near the charging station stiffened. A woman in a wool coat lowered her phone halfway, her eyes widening. Officer Miller looked from Ethan to the phone, then back again. Ryan watched Linda carefully. This was the first crack, not fear yet. Confusion. Linda cleared her throat. Well, Mr. Carter, she said, forcing her voice back into something professional. Your sons are causing a disruption inside a secure boarding area. Ethan didn't move. Ryan leaned his hip against the counter, arms folded. The voice on the phone was silent for 2 seconds. 3. Then Jonathan Carter spoke again. Are my sons breaking any laws? Officer Miller stepped forward instinctively. This is Officer Miller with Denver Airport Police, he said toward the phone. We were told there was a disturbance. Officer Miller, Jonathan Carter said. The tone shifted. Not hostile, but absolute. Have my sons assaulted anyone? Miller glanced briefly at Linda. No, sir. Have they damaged property? No, sir. Have they threatened anyone? Miller hesitated, then shook his head. No. Across the room, someone whispered quietly. Oh boy. Jonathan Carter continued. Then why exactly are armed officers standing in front of them? Miller looked at Linda again. She reported a trespass, sir. There is no trespass, Jonathan Carter said. The words were flat, heavy. They have paid tickets. Ethan watched Linda's face. The color had begun to drain from it. Ryan noticed too. He leaned closer to the phone. Also, Dad, he added casually, she flagged our tickets as disruptive. The silence on the line lasted longer this time. Then Jonathan Carter spoke again. Officer Miller. Yes, sir. I would appreciate it if you stayed exactly where you are. Miller straightened instinctively. Of course. But not to remove my sons. The words were slow now. Measured. Stay there to ensure their safety. A ripple moved through the watching passengers. Someone muttered under their breath. Holy hell. Behind the podium, Mike Donnelly's hand slipped slowly away from the taser on his belt. Ryan noticed. Ethan noticed everything. Linda opened her mouth. Sir, she began quickly, with all due respect, airline protocol. Protocol? Jonathan Carter said. The word sliced through her sentence. Does protocol instruct employees to profile passengers based on clothing? Linda's throat clicked. I did not profile anyone. Did you call my sons criminals? I never said that. Ryan leaned toward the phone again. You called us thugs. Linda spun toward him. I did not. Is that true? Jonathan Carter asked quietly. Linda's voice faltered. The silence answered for her. Across the gate area, the tension was becoming something electric. Passengers were no longer pretending not to watch. Every eye in the room was fixed on the podium. Officer Miller shifted his stance slightly, suddenly aware he might be standing in the wrong position. Then the jet bridge door opened. A tall man in a pilot's uniform stepped out, adjusting his cap under his arm. Captain Thomas Reynolds. Silver hair. 4 stripes on his sleeve. He looked irritated. Linda, he said. Why are we not boarding? Linda turned toward him desperately. Captain, there's a security situation." Reynolds glanced toward the brothers. 2 men in hoodies, one holding a phone. Dozens of passengers watching. "What kind of security situation?" he asked. Linda pointed at Ethan. They forced their way through security. Ryan laughed out loud. Reynolds frowned. Ethan held up the phone. "Captain Reynolds," he said calmly. "There's someone on the line for you." Reynolds hesitated. "Who?" Ethan simply said one word. "Jonathan." The captain froze. For a moment he didn't move. Then slowly he stepped forward and took the phone. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully. "Yes, Captain Reynolds." The captain straightened immediately. "Sir." "How long have you flown for my company?" Jonathan Carter asked. 20 years, sir. Since the merger." "Good." Reynolds felt the eyes of the entire gate area on him. "Then listen carefully." The words were quiet, but there was no mistaking them. "Do not push back from that gate." Reynolds blinked. "Sir, we're fully boarded except for—" "I don't care." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "That aircraft does not move." Reynolds felt a small knot tighten in his stomach. "Sir, there are 300 passengers on board. If my sons are not good enough to sit in seats 1A and 1B, Jonathan Carter said, then nobody sits in them." A gasp moved through the crowd. Someone dropped their phone. Reynolds looked toward Linda. She was pale now, almost grey. "Sir," he said carefully, "are you instructing me to delay departure?" "I am instructing you," Jonathan Carter replied, "to cancel the flight." The word cancel seemed to echo across the terminal. Reynolds stared at the phone. "Sir, that would cost the airline." "Millions," Jonathan Carter finished. "I am aware." Reynolds felt sweat forming under his collar. "Disembark the aircraft," Carter continued. The crowd behind them erupted into confused whispers. "You're serious?" Ryan murmured. Ethan didn't answer. Reynolds looked out at the passengers gathered in the gate area. Phones recording, faces stunned. Then he handed the phone back to Ethan. The captain turned slowly toward Linda Parker. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he leaned closer. "You have no idea what you've just done," he whispered. Reynolds picked up the gate microphone. His voice came out heavy. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "this is Captain Reynolds. I regret to inform you that Flight SB402 to London has been cancelled by order of the chairman." And just like that, the entire terminal exploded. The reaction hit like a shockwave. For half a second, there was silence. Then the entire gate area erupted at once. Voices rose in disbelief. Suitcases scraped across the floor as passengers stood up abruptly. Someone near the window shouted, "You can't be serious." Another voice snapped, "I paid $12,000 for that seat." The quiet order of Gate B14 collapsed into chaos. Captain Reynolds lowered the microphone slowly. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved across the room, measuring the damage that had just been unleashed. 300 passengers on that aircraft, dozens more waiting to board, all of them now staring at the podium, and at Linda Parker. The passengers already seated inside the plane began spilling out of the jet bridge in waves. Confused faces first, then irritated ones, people talking loudly into phones, others demanding answers. What do you mean, cancelled? We're already boarded. I have a connection in London. The noise built quickly. Anger moves fast in crowded places. Linda took one step back from the podium. Her confidence was gone now. Completely gone. "Captain," she said weakly, "you can't actually cancel the flight." Reynolds turned toward her slowly. "I didn't," he said. Then he nodded once toward Ethan Carter. He did. Linda looked at Ethan. Really looked at him for the first time. The hoodie. The calm expression. The phone still in his hand. And suddenly something inside her mind began rearranging itself in a way she didn't like. Ryan leaned slightly toward his brother. "You realize what's happening now, right?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah. Mob situation in about 30 seconds. Ryan looked at the growing crowd pouring out of the jet bridge. More like 10. Officer Miller stepped closer to the brothers now, his entire posture different. He wasn't blocking them anymore. If anything, he was subtly positioning himself between them and the angry passengers gathering around the podium. Mike Donnelly had gone very still. He kept glancing between Ethan, the phone, and Linda Parker, as if trying to understand how everything had flipped so fast. Then Ethan lifted the phone again. "Dad," he said. The noise around them was rising quickly now. Passengers shouting questions at the gate agents, someone demanding a supervisor, someone else yelling about missed meetings. "You still there?" "I'm here," Jonathan Carter replied. His voice remained calm. Too calm. "What's the situation?" Ryan looked around the terminal. "People are getting pretty worked up." "I expected that," Carter said. At the edge of the crowd, a short man in a wrinkled suit suddenly came running down the concourse. Arthur Whitman, 55 years old, station manager for Skybridge Airlines at Denver International Airport. He looked like a man whose entire career had just been dropped into a blender. Sweat soaked through the collar of his shirt as he skidded to a stop in front of the podium. "Mr. Carter," he gasped toward Ethan. He barely glanced at Linda, barely noticed the shouting passengers. His eyes were locked on Ethan and Ryan. "I am so sorry," Whitman said. The words tumbled out of him. "I was on the other side of the terminal when I got the alert." Ryan lifted an eyebrow. "What alert?" Whitman swallowed. "Code Black." Several nearby passengers went quiet. Code Black inside an airline system meant one thing: top-level executive involvement. Ethan held out the phone. "Dad wants to talk to you." Whitman took the phone with both hands, like it was made of glass. "Mr. Carter," he said breathlessly. Jonathan Carter didn't waste time. "Arthur." "Yes, sir. First step." Whitman straightened instinctively. "I want Linda Parker removed from the floor immediately." Whitman turned slowly toward Linda. For a moment, she looked like she might collapse. "Give me your badge," he said. Linda stared at him. "Arthur, please." "Now." Her hand trembled as she reached for the lanyard around her neck. The plastic ID badge came free with a quiet snap. Whitman took it. The sound of the crowd grew louder again behind them. But something else was happening now. People were beginning to understand. Phones zoomed in closer. Passengers whispered to each other. The name Jonathan Carter was traveling through the room. Whitman lifted the phone again. "It's done." "Good," Carter said. Second step. Whitman braced himself. I want every incident report that woman has filed for the last 6 years pulled immediately. Whitman blinked. All of them? All of them. Ryan watched Linda carefully. Her breathing had become shallow. Panicked. Jonathan Carter continued. If there is a pattern of discrimination or misconduct in those reports... Whitman nodded rapidly. We'll investigate. No, Carter said. The single word landed like a hammer. You will shut down this entire terminal operation until you understand exactly what your staff has been doing. Whitman felt the blood drain from his face. Sir, shutting down operations would mean grounding multiple flights. How many? Whitman swallowed. Roughly 20. The crowd nearby fell quiet again. 20 flights meant thousands of passengers. Jonathan Carter didn't hesitate. Ground them. Whitman closed his eyes briefly. Yes, sir. Ryan exhaled softly. You're nuking the entire schedule. Ethan kept watching Linda. His expression didn't change. Whitman handed the phone back. The shouting from the passengers had shifted now. The anger was still there, but it had direction. And that direction was Linda Parker. A tall man near the front row pointed at her. You're the one who caused this? Another passenger stepped forward. You cancelled our flight because of 2 guys in hoodies. Linda backed into the wall. Her hands shook visibly now. The authority she had used 20 minutes earlier had evaporated completely. Ethan stepped forward. Hey! His voice cut through the noise. It wasn't loud, but it carried. The crowd slowly quieted. 300 people turned toward him. Ethan looked at them. Really looked. My dad grounded the plane, he said. A few passengers groaned, but Ethan raised a hand. He did it because this woman decided we didn't belong here. He pointed toward Linda. She called security. She called the police. She tried to have us arrested. Silence settled across the gate. Ethan's voice lowered. And if we didn't have someone on the other end of that phone, he paused, you'd probably be watching us get dragged out of here instead. Nobody spoke, not even Linda, because suddenly the crowd understood something much bigger than a cancelled flight. They had just watched exactly how easily power could be abused and how quickly it could collapse. Arthur Whitman's phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He ignored it. Another call came through immediately, then another. Operations, corporate dispatch, customer relations. The entire Skybridge network had just felt the impact of a single command from the chairman. Whitman wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. His breathing was shallow now, almost ragged. Around him, the noise at gate B14 had shifted from anger into something heavier. Suspicion. Passengers weren't shouting as much anymore. They were staring. And most of them were staring at Linda Parker. She stood pressed against the wall beside the gate podium, her shoulders hunched, hands clasped in front of her, as if that posture could somehow make her invisible. It didn't. Ryan Carter watched her carefully. You know what's interesting, he said quietly to Ethan. Ethan didn't take his eyes off Linda. What? Ryan tilted his head slightly. She never once asked to see our IDs. Ethan nodded slowly. She didn't need to. Why not? Because she had already decided who we were. Ryan gave a humorless chuckle. Across the room, Officer Miller had stepped away from the brothers and was now speaking quietly into his radio. His earlier authority had melted into something closer to caution. Mike Donnelly stood near the luggage cart again, but his posture had changed completely. His arms were folded tightly across his chest now, his eyes drifting toward the floor whenever Ethan glanced his way. The crowd continued murmuring. Then Whitman's phone buzzed again. This time he answered. "Yes," he said breathlessly. "I'm aware." A pause. "No, we cannot push back any aircraft until further notice." Another pause. Whitman turned away slightly from the crowd. "Yes, I understand the cost." He glanced briefly toward Ethan. "Believe me, I understand." He ended the call. Ryan leaned closer to Ethan. "Corporate meltdown." Ethan nodded faintly. Then Whitman approached the brothers again. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully. Ethan looked at him. Whitman lowered his voice. "There's something else you should see." Ryan frowned. "What?" Whitman gestured toward the service hallway behind the gate. "Come with me." Ethan studied his face for a moment, then nodded. Ryan followed as the three of them stepped away from the crowd and into the quieter back corridor behind the gate counters. The noise of the terminal faded slightly. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Whitman led them into a small operations office filled with computer monitors and paperwork. He shut the door. Ryan leaned against the desk. "What's going on?" Whitman turned one of the monitors toward them. The Skybridge internal reservation system filled the screen. "Passenger manifest, seat assignments, upgrade logs." Whitman scrolled quickly through the records. "I pulled the flight history," he said. Ethan stepped closer. The screen stopped at the first-class cabin layout. Seats 1A and 1B. Ryan pointed. "That's us." Whitman nodded. "Supposed to be." He tapped the keyboard again. The system history appeared. Time stamps. Seat assignment changes. Override commands. Whitman pointed at one entry. 1:45 this afternoon. Ryan leaned closer. "What happened then?" Whitman's voice dropped. "Your seats were unlocked." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Unlocked?" "They were blocked in the system," Whitman said. "Chairman priority hold." Ryan frowned. "So how did someone override that?" Whitman typed again. The screen updated. A new entry appeared. Seat 1A assigned. Seat 1B assigned. Ryan squinted. "Who the hell are the Stantons?" Whitman sighed. "Passengers currently sitting at gate B14. Ryan stared at him. "You're telling me someone gave away our seats?" Whitman nodded slowly. "And those assignments were made by—" He pointed to the issuer ID on the screen. Ryan read it out loud. "Agent B7789. Whitman looked up. "That's Linda Parker." The room went quiet. Ryan let out a long breath. "Well," he said. "That explains everything." Ethan didn't speak. Whitman continued. "The Stantons are flying on buddy passes." Ryan blinked. "Employee passes?" Whitman nodded. "Friends and family tickets?" Ryan's voice sharpened. "You're kidding." Whitman shook his head. "No." He opened another window on the screen. "Payment records, internal notes." Then he turned the monitor fully toward Ethan. "I spoke with them," Whitman said quietly. "Spoke with who?" "The Stantons." Ryan crossed his arms. "And?" Whitman hesitated. They admitted they paid Linda $500 each for the upgrade. Ryan stared at him. Cash? Whitman nodded. Yes. Ethan finally spoke. So she sold the seats. Whitman nodded again. Ryan rubbed his forehead. And when we showed up, she panicked, Whitman said. She couldn't scan your tickets because the system would immediately show the double booking. Ryan let out a sharp laugh. So instead she calls security. Whitman nodded grimly. And marks you as disruptive. Ethan looked back at the screen. The timestamp, the override code, the seat reassignment, all sitting there like evidence waiting to be discovered. Whitman picked up the office phone. Security, he said. A pause. Yes, this is Arthur Whitman. Another pause. I need Linda Parker located immediately. Ryan leaned back against the desk. What happens now? Whitman's face hardened. Now? He hung up the phone. Now we call the police. Ryan glanced at Ethan. Ethan was already turning towards the door. Because out in the gate area, the shouting had started again. And this time, it sounded different, sharper, closer to panic. Ryan grabbed the duffel bag. Let's go see what happens when the truth shows up. By the time Ethan Carter pushed open the operations office door, the noise outside had turned from angry to feral. 300 travelers with cancelled plans will do that. The gate area looked nothing like it had 15 minutes earlier. People were standing now, clustered in tight circles, phones raised, voices rising and falling in waves of disbelief. A man in a wool overcoat was arguing loudly with a gate agent. A young woman was pacing near the window, speaking rapidly into her phone about a missed connection in London. And in the center of it all stood Linda Parker. But the room had changed around her. The anger that had been aimed at Ethan and Ryan earlier had shifted direction. Like a compass needle snapping to true north, it now pointed directly at the woman in the Navy uniform. Is that her? Someone asked loudly. That's the one who called the cops, another voice said. Linda's back was pressed against the wall near the boarding podium. Her shoulders had curled inward, as if she could shrink into the drywall behind her. The carefully styled hair, the crisp uniform, the posture of authority she'd worn like armor earlier that afternoon. It was all falling apart. Arthur Whitman stepped out behind the brothers. The crowd noticed him immediately. Finally, a passenger barked. Someone in charge. Whitman raised both hands in a gesture that was half apology, half surrender. Ladies and gentlemen, he began. But the crowd wasn't ready to listen yet. You cancelled our flight. Who's paying for hotels? I have a conference tomorrow morning. Voices collided and layered over each other until the room buzzed like a hive. Ethan walked forward slowly. Not toward the podium. Toward Linda. Ryan stayed a half step behind him. Linda saw them coming. For the first time since this began, she didn't look angry. She looked terrified. Her voice came out thin. I didn't know, she said. Ethan stopped 3 feet in front of her. The crowd quieted again. Phones tilted closer. I didn't know who you were, Linda said, her words tumbling over themselves now. You have to understand that. Ryan folded his arms. You're right, he said. You didn't know. Linda nodded desperately. So this is all just a misunderstanding. Ryan shook his head slowly. No. He pointed back toward the operations office. "That's not what this is." Arthur Whitman stepped forward beside them. He held a printed sheet of paper in his hand. "Linda," he said quietly. Her eyes flicked toward him. Whitman placed the paper on the podium. "This is the seat assignment log for Flight SB-402. Linda stared at the paper, but didn't reach for it. Whitman continued. "At 1:45 this afternoon, seats 1A and 1B were unlocked from a chairman priority hold. The passengers closest to the podium leaned forward. Ryan glanced at Ethan. Ethan didn't look away from Linda. Whitman tapped the paper. 1 minute later, those seats were assigned to 2 passengers flying on buddy passes. He lifted his eyes to meet hers. The Stantons. A murmur moved through the crowd. Linda's mouth opened slightly. Whitman's voice sharpened. Those seats belonged to Ethan and Ryan Carter. Linda shook her head weakly. "No." Whitman's expression hardened. "We spoke to the Stantons." Ryan leaned against the podium now, watching her like a man observing the final moves of a chess game. "They told us everything." Linda's breathing grew faster. "They said they paid you $500 each." The number hit the room like a dropped glass. "Cash." Someone in the crowd gasped. Another passenger whispered, "She sold the seats?" Whitman nodded once. "And when the actual ticket holders arrived?" He let the sentence hang. Ryan finished it. "You panicked." Linda's voice broke. "I thought the seats were dead inventory." Ryan laughed once, sharply. "So you ran a side business?" Linda's eyes darted around the gate area. "Every person watching, every phone recording." "I've been here 15 years, she said suddenly. "I've never had a complaint." Whitman's voice was flat. "You have 62 denied boarding reports in the last 6 years. The words landed like a gavel. Linda's knees buckled slightly. Whitman continued. "We're reviewing every single one of them." Ryan rubbed his chin slowly. "Bet there's a pattern." Ethan finally spoke again. His voice was quiet, but it cut straight through the room. "You tried to have us arrested." Linda looked at him. Tears had started to form in the corners of her eyes. "I was scared." Ryan tilted his head. "Of what?" Linda swallowed. "The system would have caught it." Ethan nodded slowly. "So you doubled down." He gestured toward Officer Miller, who still stood nearby with his partner. "You called the police." Linda's voice rose suddenly. "I had to." The words burst out of her before she could stop them. "If you got to the scanner, the double booking would show up." The crowd gasped again. Ryan pushed himself upright from the podium. "There it is." Whitman turned toward Officer Miller. "Officer." Miller stepped forward. Whitman's voice was calm again, but there was steel underneath it now. "I'm filing a formal complaint on behalf of Skybridge Airlines." Linda shook her head violently. "No, Arthur, please." Whitman didn't look at her. "Grand theft, fraud, falsification of corporate records, and filing a false police report." The officer's partner pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click was loud in the sudden silence. Linda's voice broke into a scream. "You can't do this," Ryan muttered under his breath. "Watch him." The officer stepped behind her. Linda twisted toward Ethan. "Mr. Carter," she said desperately. Ethan didn't move. "I have a mortgage," she said. Her voice collapsed into sobbing. "I made a mistake." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No." His voice was steady. "You made a choice." The handcuffs closed around Linda Parker's wrists with a final metallic snap. And for the first time that day, the power she had wielded so confidently was completely gone. The sound of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed louder than anyone expected. For a moment, the entire gate area froze. Linda Parker stood rigid between the two officers, wrists locked behind her back, the crisp navy uniform she had worn with such authority now hanging on her like a costume that no longer fit. Her shoulders shook as the reality finally reached her. The woman who had controlled this terminal for 15 years was now a prisoner in the same hallway where she had judged hundreds of travelers every week. Officer Miller cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you're coming with us." Linda's voice cracked as she tried to speak again. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Ryan Carter exhaled slowly beside the podium. "Funny thing about lies," he said quietly. "They usually do." The officers began guiding Linda toward the corridor that led back to airport security offices. The crowd parted instinctively as she passed through them. The same passengers who had listened to her orders earlier were now staring at her like she was a stranger. Some filmed. Others whispered. One older man shook his head slowly. "You tried to ruin those boys' lives over $1,000? Linda said nothing. She couldn't. The officers led her past Ethan. For a second, she turned her head toward him. Her mascara had begun to run down her cheeks. "Mr. Carter," she said softly. Ethan didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't look angry either. He just watched. The officers continued walking. The crowd followed the movement like a wave of silent witnesses until the hallway door closed behind them. And just like that, Linda Parker disappeared from gate B14. But the tension she had created did not disappear with her. The passengers were still there. 300 disrupted travel plans. 300 stories that had collided into one afternoon. Arthur Whitman stepped forward again. He looked older than he had an hour earlier. His voice was hoarse. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said carefully, "Skybridge Airlines will be providing hotel accommodations for everyone affected by this cancellation." A man near the front row raised his voice. "You'd better." Whitman nodded. "All tickets will be refunded. We are also arranging alternate flights." A few people muttered under their breath, but the anger had softened. Because the story had changed. It was no longer about a delayed flight. It was about what they had just witnessed. A middle-aged woman stepped forward slowly. She looked at Ethan and Ryan with a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. "I saw the whole thing," she said. Her voice was quiet. "That woman treated you terribly." Ryan shrugged lightly. "It happens." The woman shook her head. "It shouldn't." A businessman who had been sitting near the charging stations approached next. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to boardrooms and negotiations. Ryan recognized him immediately. Richard Coleman, the same man who had stood behind them at the check-in counter earlier, the same man who had looked at his watch with irritation while Linda dismissed them. Coleman stopped a few feet away. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he sighed. I owe you both an apology. Ryan lifted an eyebrow. Do you? Coleman nodded. Yes. He glanced briefly toward the corridor where Linda had been taken. I assumed she was right. Ryan folded his arms. Most people did. Coleman nodded slowly. That's the problem. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. Richard Coleman, he said. Managing partner at Northgate Capital. He held the card out toward Ethan. Ethan took it. Coleman continued. I run a private investment fund, he said, and I pride myself on reading people correctly. Ryan smirked slightly. Not today. Coleman gave a small, embarrassed laugh. No, not today. He looked directly at Ethan. I judged you based on what I saw. Ethan slipped the card into his pocket. What did you see? Coleman hesitated, then answered honestly. 2 young men in hoodies, standing in the wrong line. Ryan nodded slowly. Exactly. Coleman looked down briefly. When you're used to certain environments, he said, you start believing you can identify who belongs. Ryan tilted his head. And who doesn't? Coleman met his eyes again. Yes. The moment stretched quietly between them. Then Coleman spoke again. I heard what you said earlier, he said. About if you didn't have someone on the phone. Ryan glanced at Ethan. Coleman continued. You're right. He paused. If you'd been anyone else, that situation might have ended very differently. The gate area was almost calm now. Passengers were beginning to collect their bags again. Some were speaking quietly with airline staff about hotels and new flights. But many were still watching the 2 brothers. Coleman straightened his jacket. I want to make something right, he said. Ryan looked amused. How? Coleman smiled faintly. You mentioned scholarships earlier when you were talking to the crowd. Ryan blinked. That was kind of off the cuff. Coleman shrugged. Still a good idea. He nodded toward Ethan. If you ever start a program for young people who want to work in aviation, I'd like to contribute. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Why? Coleman answered without hesitation. Because today reminded me how easy it is to underestimate someone. Ethan studied him for a moment, then nodded once. We'll keep that in mind. Coleman extended his hand. Ethan shook it. The businessman gave a final respectful nod, then turned and walked back into the thinning crowd. Ryan watched him go. Not the worst apology I've heard. Ethan glanced toward the terminal windows. Outside, the late afternoon sky over Denver had begun turning orange behind the distant mountains. Ryan nudged his shoulder. So what now? Arthur Whitman approached again. He looked exhausted but relieved. Your ride is ready, he said. Ryan frowned. Our ride? Whitman nodded. The chairman's jet landed 20 minutes ago. Ryan blinked. He flew here. Whitman smiled faintly. He said nobody messes with his boys. Ryan looked at Ethan. Ethan shook his head slowly. He didn't have to do that. Whitman gestured toward the terminal exit. Tell him that yourself. Ryan slung the duffel bag over his shoulder. Well, he said, let's go see Dad. The black SUV was waiting at the curb outside the terminal. Its engine hummed softly in the cold Denver air, exhaust rising in slow white clouds against the fading evening sky. The driver stood beside the open rear door, his dark overcoat pulled tight against the wind that swept across the drop-off lanes. Ethan Carter stepped out of the sliding doors first. Ryan followed a step behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Behind them, the glass walls of Denver International Airport reflected the last light of sunset. Inside that building, hundreds of passengers were still dealing with the fallout from what had happened at Gate B-14. But out here, the world felt strangely quiet. The driver nodded respectfully. "Mr. Carter." Ryan glanced at the vehicle. "You guys got here fast." The driver smiled faintly. "Your father doesn't like waiting." Ryan tossed the duffel bag into the back seat and slid inside. Ethan followed, closing the door behind him as the SUV pulled smoothly away from the curb. The airport terminal drifted past the tinted windows, long concrete lanes, taxiing aircraft in the distance, control tower lights blinking against the darkening sky. Ryan leaned back in the leather seat. "You know this story is already everywhere, right?" Ethan glanced at him. "What do you mean?" Ryan pulled out his phone. The screen lit up with notifications, videos, news alerts, social media clips already circulating. One of the videos showed Linda Parker shouting into the microphone at Gate B-14. Another showed the moment Ethan held up the phone and Jonathan Carter's voice came through the speaker. Ryan shook his head. Some kid live-streamed the whole thing. Ethan looked out the window again. He didn't seem surprised. The SUV turned onto the service road that led toward the private aviation terminal. The main airport traffic faded behind them. Rows of hangars appeared ahead under tall floodlights. And then they saw it. The jet. A sleek Gulfstream G650 sitting on the tarmac with its engines humming quietly. The polished fuselage reflected the floodlights like silver glass. Near the bottom of the aircraft stairs stood a tall figure in a dark coat. Jonathan Carter. The driver brought the SUV to a stop. Ryan whistled softly. He really flew here. Ethan opened the door and stepped out into the cold air. Jonathan Carter walked down the aircraft stairs before they even reached the plane. He moved with the kind of presence that made people step aside without thinking. 6'3", broad shoulders, 62 years old, and still carrying the same controlled intensity that had built Carter Global Holdings from a 2-room office into one of the most powerful aviation companies in the country. He stopped in front of Ethan first. His eyes moved quickly over his son's face, checking for injuries the way fathers always do. "You all right?" Ethan nodded. "We're fine." Jonathan turned to Ryan. "You?" Ryan gave a small grin. "Got shoved by a security guard." Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. "I saw the footage." Ryan laughed quietly. "Of course you did." Jonathan pulled him into a quick embrace before stepping back. The three of them stood there for a moment in the cold wind. The jet engines hummed behind them. Ethan finally spoke. "You didn't have to cancel the whole flight." Jonathan looked at him. "Yes, I did." His voice was calm, but absolute. "If I allow my own sons to be treated like criminals inside my own company, what message does that send to everyone else who flies with us?" Ryan shrugged. "Probably a bad one." Jonathan nodded. "Exactly." They walked toward the stairs together. Inside the jet, The atmosphere changed instantly. Warm lighting, soft leather seats, the smell of fresh coffee. Quiet. No crowds, no shouting passengers, just space. Ryan dropped into one of the seats and stretched his legs out. "I'm starting to understand why you stopped flying commercial." Jonathan poured 3 glasses of sparkling water from a chilled bottle on the table. "You'll still fly commercial," he said. Ryan raised an eyebrow. "After today?" Jonathan handed him a glass. "Especially after today." Ethan sat across from them. Jonathan took his own seat and leaned forward slightly. "Arthur Whitman sent me the preliminary report," he said. Ethan nodded. "She sold the seats." Jonathan's expression hardened. "For 2 years." Ryan blinked. 2 years? Jonathan nodded. "She's been unlocking blocked seats and selling them to passengers on the side." Ryan whistled quietly. "That's bold." Jonathan shook his head. "That's greed." He took a slow sip of water. "The district attorney has already been contacted. Fraud charges are being filed tonight." Ryan leaned back in his seat. "Well," he looked toward Ethan. "Karma works fast." Ethan smiled faintly. Jonathan set his glass down. "And the security guard who put his hands on you is finished in this industry," he added. Ryan nodded approvingly. "Good." Outside the windows, the runway lights stretched across the darkness like glowing threads. The pilot's voice came through the cabin speaker. "Ready for departure, sir." Jonathan looked at his sons. "Let's go home." The engines roared louder as the aircraft began moving down the runway. Within minutes, the Gulf Stream lifted smoothly into the night sky, climbing above the city lights of Denver. Ethan looked down through the window. The airport shrank beneath them. The terminal where everything had happened was just a cluster of lights now. Small, distant. Ryan broke the silence. "You know," he said, "this whole thing started because of a hoodie." Jonathan smiled faintly. "No." He leaned back in his seat. "It started because someone believed they had the right to decide who belongs." The jet leveled off high above the clouds. Inside the quiet cabin, the Carter family finally relaxed. The chaos of the airport was already fading behind them. But the story would travel much farther. Because moments like that expose something deeper than a single bad employee. They expose how easily people judge, how quickly power is abused, and how dangerous it is to underestimate someone whose story you don't know yet. That is why respect matters. That is why integrity matters. And that is why no one should ever be judged by what they wear or how they look when they walk through a door. If you enjoyed this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. And in the comments, write 3 simple words: respect, truth, justice,